breaking down around us, the family breaking down, social institutions. But God, we look to you because you are our rock, the everlasting God. Your word is true. Teach us tonight. As your children, we come to learn of you. Speak to us, Father. Give us understanding and help us to be like you. You make your sun to rise on the evil and on the good. You make your rain to fall on the just and on the unjust. Help us to be a wise people, not an oppressive people, but a wise people, a compassionate people, a generous people, that we would be like the moon that reflects the sun, and we would reflect all of your wisdom and the good that you have done. Thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so I titled this Oppressor, the Oppressor, Choose None of His Ways, which is not from this text. That is from Proverbs 3:31. The ESV says, do not envy a man of violence and do not choose any of his ways. And then the King James says, envy thou not the oppressor and choose none of his ways. That's the phrase that came to my mind. Now, the word oppression in English appears in this passage. It's a different word than here. In fact, the word that is used for oppressor in Proverbs, I looked up the word oppressor in 3 different texts that I had cross-referenced, and they were all different words, which was a little surprising. But this word is a word you may recognize. It's the word Hamas, which is the name of the Palestinian or terrorist organization. When God looked at the earth and he saw that it was filled with violence in Genesis 6, it's the word Hamas. I'm not sure if it means the same thing in Arabic or not, but they are both Semitic languages. It very well may. And it means violence. So do not envy a man of violence. That can be violence as in a bully, playground bully, who loves to find somebody weak and pound on them or make fun of them or mock them because it makes them feel strong and maybe gets the attention off of their insufficiencies and puts it on someone else. It's a word that could be used to injustice, like bearing false witness in a court of law is, I think, referred to as an act of violence. Oppression. Various verses we're going to look at tonight, a different word, oppression, are going to deal with using money as an oppressor, loans as a means of oppression. But God doesn't want us to be an oppressor. Sometimes it appears advantageous to use tools of oppression, of bullying, of violence. It can make us feel real big and strong and superior to others. But God doesn't want that to be a characteristic of his people. And so anyway, oppression. Let's look. This first one is a review. We covered it last week briefly, and we moved on. But I want to just mention it again because it has to do with lending, and a few of our verses have to do with borrowing money and lending out. So in Deuteronomy 24, verse 6 says, no one shall take a mill or an upper millstone in pledge, for that would be taking life in pledge. So the idea of a pledge would be, if you don't pay the loan, we can take this back. So it would be kind of like you get the bank has the title to your car, and if you don't pay on the note, they can repossess the car. And so here God says, well, when you do a loan, you're not to take an upper millstone in a pledge. And the reason why is, he says, because it's their life. They would make their bread with millstones. They would take their grain. It's very hard to eat wheat in a kernel form. It needs to be ground. And if you've got to spend 5 hours a day grinding wheat with between 2 rocks, it's hard to feed a family that way. And it's hard to get a job that can get out of the hole you're in that way too. So God says you're not to take a millstone as a pledge because it's a man's life. It's like taking something absolutely essential to life. You can't do that. You kind of see that reflected a little bit in some modern bankruptcy laws. So like if which can be abused, a bank, I believe, can, if a person declares bankruptcy, there are certain things that cannot be confiscated, I think, including I knew somebody that went through bankruptcy one time, and they got to keep one car and their house. And the idea being that if they're homeless or they can't drive to work, they could be permanently poor. And we don't want people to be permanently poor. So there's limits. And you say, well, it's not fair to the lender. You know, that's the lender. Well, lenders should use discretion on who they lend to. There is risk. There's no risk-free loans. There are limits, and we're going to see this theme in several of the verses here. There are limits to what a lender can do. Now, in the Old Testament, you could be, if it was part of the agreement of the loan, you could be sold into slavery for not being able to pay back a loan, which was a way of saying, listen, if I can't pay back, if this business venture fails or whatever, and I can't pay you back, then I will actually go into indentured servitude in order to repay the loan. That could be done. So there was real consequences on the side of the borrower. But this goes to show that a lender does not have unlimited rights to recollect a loan. One of them being something that is essential for life could not be confiscated. So we talked about that last time, but I wanted to bring it up again because of the verses that follow. Anybody have any comments about that or questions? I think one thing I'll say here is, you know, we have laws against loan sharks. The idea of the mafia or some other group gives you a loan, and if you don't pay back the loan, they'll come and break your legs. That in a similar way obviously would violate the principle here. You can't go breaking legs and breaking arms, which would further make it harder to pay back a loan. You know, you're in a deeper hole. God puts limits on that. So here it's a millstone, but I think every society needs to ask, okay, does this loan violate this principle of making it virtually impossible to pay back a loan, or to the point where a person's life itself is at stake? We have fairly decent laws, I think, in this realm, because the gospel has had an effect on our society, and this kind of thinking has made a difference. Definitely not perfect, but at least in our society there are limits to loans, and that reflects biblical justice. It's not that way in all societies at all times, in all places. Do you have a point, Brian?
Yeah, I do.
Microphone? You want to bring the microphone?
Yeah, I just wanted to know whether it was a person who was a miller who ground other people's wheat, or whether it was just like everybody had a millstone. Because if it was a person who did that as a business, there would be a lot of people depending on him to grind their daily bread or their daily
Well, that is a profound thought, because you may be right. I remember seeing a picture of an olive press, which is different, but it was, and I think it was near Gethsemane. You know, the word Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus sweat great drops of blood. Gethsemane means olive press. And I'm not sure if it's there or somewhere near there that a large olive press, it was like a big, kind of like there's a moving piece of wood in the middle and a piece of wood with a big round stone on it, and they would put the olives in the olive press, and they would go in a circle, and then the oil would flow out a funnel in the side. And I believe, if I recall, it was thought to have been used by the whole village. So that's an interesting thing. It wouldn't just be, basically many people depend upon it, in which case if I would have thought of that insight earlier, I may have a lot more interesting things to say about this, because I don't know, there might be a lot of implications to this. I have concerns. You know, I'm always like, you know, what do I think about China buying up farmland in America? What do I think about the steel industry being totally maybe farmed out to a foreign nation? Makes me a little nervous. And I don't really have a great verse to say, to specifically say why, but it makes me nervous if your enemies have the ability, like the Philistines, when they insisted that they get their implements, farm implements sharpened. There's no blacksmiths, didn't have any grinding stones. If they wanted to get their farm implements sharpened, they had to go to the Philistines. Why? Because they wanted to take away their ability to defend themselves. They didn't want them having swords and knives and sharp things. They didn't want them to be able to mass produce them and thereby throw off their oppressors, kind of like gun control in the Old Testament. Take away all of the, if you want to get your farm implements sharpened, you go to the Philistines. And it makes me nervous that our land, what if our land was all bought up by foreign nations and all of our grain was shipped overseas and it's being produced here, but we're not getting to eat our own food and there's shortages. That makes me nervous. Or let's say we went to, I heard one time mention if we ever went to war with China, pretty soon we'd have no shoes because they make all of our, Malaysia and China make our shoes. Now, I don't know, some of that might be getting to irrational fear, but the idea that a whole village could be dependent upon one millstone and that could be a pledge and a loan, and then the miller doesn't pay back the loan, and many lives who depend upon that millstone be affected, maybe there's implications that we could delve into further because of your insight. It's a very good thought. And maybe we're not talking about the household millstone. Maybe we're talking about the guy whose equipment that took many years to acquire, if he loses it, the whole village suffers. There's a lot to think about there. If anybody has any more insight on it, I'm interested because it's a thought I hadn't had, honestly. All right, well, let's go on then. All right, so here's another verse that made me think here. Maybe I should have put this lower, but it says that Proverbs 18:23, just as a cross-reference, the poor uses entreaties, but the rich answer roughly. And King James says, the poor useth entreaties, but the rich answer roughly. Almost the same word for word. I didn't need to put both verses on there. But I brought that up because of what kind of comes next. This idea that a lot of times wealthy people, I've seen it even, patrons to waitresses. I've seen waitresses mistreated, for example. And it's like, oh, well, you're a waitress. You're beneath me because I'm something special. And people complain about the food. They're rude. They leave lousy tips and can be very demanding. And this is actually an observation. This isn't forbidding or commanding something. It's an observation that poor people beg, plead, make entreaties, while rich people oftentimes will answer roughly. And it's an observation about human nature that Proverbs is making here. It doesn't condemn it. It doesn't advocate it. It's just making the observation. People who are poor have to be really careful with their words, and rich people oftentimes feel entitled to be rough because they feel that they're in a superior position. And maybe they are in a superior position, but that doesn't mean they're superior. So that was a verse I had in mind when I go to the next verse here in Deuteronomy 24. When you make your neighbor a loan of any sort, you shall not go into his house to collect his pledge. You shall stand outside, and the man to whom you make the loan shall bring the pledge out to you. And if he is a poor man, you shall not sleep in his pledge. You shall restore to him the pledge as the sun sets, that he may sleep in his cloak and bless you, and it shall be righteousness for you before Yahweh your God. Let's deal with the first verse 11 first, because I think they're really kind of two different thoughts. If your neighbor has loan of any sort, it says you're not to go into his house and collect what's guaranteed. He has to bring it out to you. You shall stand outside, and the man to whom you make the loan shall bring the pledge out to you. This reminds. First of all, anybody else have any thoughts on this before I give some thoughts on it? If you do, as a person who's been a landlord, this reminds me of the position of a landlord. A landlord is a lender. Some people say, once in a while, you'll hear people say, "Well, do you rent or do you own your home?" And, well, if you want to get really technical, do any of us own our home? What happens if you quit paying your property taxes? The landlord kicks you off. That's why our founding fathers thought property taxes were extremely oppressive. I think Bill Eigel wanted to get rid of property taxes, but I believe he's off the ticket now. Not many people are talking about that. It's probably most people didn't want that because property taxes fund the public schools, and it's most people's favorite form of welfare. It's public schools. People don't think of that as welfare, do they? Really? It's like, oh, I'm not one of those people on welfare. Well, we got farm subsidies, we got corporate subsidies, we've got all kinds of Social Security, and we are at least partially a socialist country already, and have been for quite a while. If you want to think about it, if you want to talk about redistribution, and one of the most heinous forms of redistribution is inflation, which we're not really dealing with here. But anyway, we are a semi-socialist nation and have been for quite a while anyway. I mean, we're a mixture. We're not. A lot of times when people gripe about capitalism, I'll say, well, tell me what it is you don't like about capitalism, and they'll proceed to tell me about some socialist program. It's really socialism. It's really a state where the state owns you. The state owns your sweat. It owns your labor, and therefore it gives you way more than a tithe. It owns your land, and it requires property taxes. But as a landlord, as I've rented to people, if I have to have permission to go in their house, unless it's an emergency, like if there was a terrible leak and I knew about it and they didn't, and it was leaking all over the place, I suppose I would have the right to go in. I certainly would exercise that anyway. But I can't just go as if you own a building and you have a tenant who even if they haven't been paying rent, you can't just go in the property. You have to have permission. That's because possession is what 9/10 of the law, they say. You can't. The renter has rights. In this case, I was starting to make a point that when you borrow money for a house, you borrow the money, you pay back the same money you borrowed plus more with interest. When you rent a house, you borrow a house, you pay back the house plus more with interest. So there was a time where they used to speak of renting money. Now we just talk about borrowing at interest, but it's really the same thing. You're borrowing money, you're paying it back with rent, aka interest. And that used to be a term that people would use, interchangeable. They would speak of renting money. For example, if you read The Richest Man in Babylon, it will speak of paying rent on money, and it's talking about an interest loan. And when you go get a mortgage, you're borrowing the money to purchase a house, and you're paying back the money, plus you're giving them more. Now, in the one circumstance, at the end of a period, theoretically, you own your house, and at the end, and on the other form of loan, you borrow the apartment, and when you're done with it, you give back the apartment plus all the money that you've paid in rent, and you own nothing. So it's kind of an eye-opener that most of us are borrowers in one sense or the other. You're borrowing a house, or you're borrowing the money to buy a house. But the borrower has rights, and you can't just go in. Like I've heard of landlords that turn off people's water or take the doors off the hinges or do other things that are illegal. But sometimes, like, well, what are you going to do? You're going to sue me? And they just do it anyway. But this verse acknowledges that the borrower, you just because he owes you some money doesn't mean you're entitled to things he doesn't owe you. And you can't just go in and get it. Microphone to Kanoa, please.
Yeah, that was something that I was thinking about too. Is it provides us something in our mind and mental image that you're not even allowed to walk into this person's house, so that you have no status over them or to show any kind of I helped you out, so now you owe me. You're not even allowed to go into their house, so they have to bring it out to you.
Yeah.
So it really creates in our mind that I guess I want to say equality kind of thing, that even though he borrowed, it doesn't mean that he is less of human or less of value than you because you were the lender.
That's right.
So,
he owes you the money back. He doesn't owe you all of his dignity and humanity and decency. You still owe him all of his rights as a fellow human being under the law. You got an opinion?
The thing that enters my mind when I think of this scenario and I play it out is that the loaner would come in and he would see objects within the house that he might want instead of the pledge that the guy wanted to pledge, and say, well, instead, I'm going to take this dog over here. I really like
Right.
this dog,
Yeah.
and so you can have the dog back when you pay the bill.
That's a good
You know,
point.
things like that.
He says, oh, I don't have it. He says, yeah, well, you got to like that TV. I like that piece of artwork. Well, that was passed down to my family. I don't care. I want it. Very good insight again. Also true. If he could go in the house, he could say, you don't got it? Well, I'll take that and that and that and that. And God says, no, you wait outside. I think you've hit the real spirit of the law and what it's saying. Gary? Microphone over here, Victoria. So you're going to have to keep your head up. Gary here.
So what if the borrower doesn't want to give back the original pledge? Like, you wait outside, but they still refuse to give back the original pledge, not the interest, not anything else. Then what?
Well, in Hebrew society, you could be taken before the elders and be forced into, if the elders decided that it was just for you to be going to slavery, Proverbs says that the borrower is slave to the lender. So there is a, and we've talked about this quite a bit. See a couple of new faces here tonight. We've talked a bit about slavery, but people really don't understand when the Bible uses the word slave or sometimes servant, how many social problems were solved by slavery that we solve in other ways that are oftentimes more heinous. So like our prison system, we got 1.3 million people in prisons today. A lot of those people in a biblical justice system would be working on some slave farm to pay back the victims, right? Slavery was not, in fact, earlier in this chapter, which I don't have it in these notes, but just a few verses ago, it said that anybody who's caught kidnapping and enslaving is to be put to death. So what we think of as slavery, oftentimes before the American Civil War, was a death penalty offense of man stealing. So the Bible doesn't allow kidnapping and forcing people into slavery. How do you become a slave? Well, voluntarily, maybe to get a trade or a skill. Instead of going into debt at a college, saying, listen, I'll be effectively your slave for 6 years, and you can teach me blacksmithing. You can teach me shepherding. And actually, if it's a brother, it says you shall not send him out as a hired slave, a hired servant. You're to send him out with a blessing. So we think we're so much better. Sometimes slavery was an alternative to our modern system of go get huge debt and have maybe very little practical skills. People would say, hey, I'd like to learn how to do that. Will you teach me? Yeah, but you don't know anything. It's not worth it to me to teach you. If so, I'll give you food and shelter, and you can help me out, and I'll do it. So slavery was a consequence, or it could be a consequence. It could be a voluntary servitude. It could be a consequence of losing a war on which you were an aggressor. It could be to pay back a loan, as is the case here, but it was a real consequence. If a person couldn't pay back their loan, and if it was a brother, it was to be an interest-free loan. But even in an interest-free loan, if a person didn't pay it back during that 6-year period, they could be a slave for 6 years. So most of the time, you didn't want to lend anything that was greater than 6 years of labor, because that was the limits of enslaving a fellow Hebrew. There's a lot we could say about slavery, but it was a consequence, and therefore, you notice today, is it still the case if you declare bankruptcy, it's on your record for 7 years? That is a shadow of the biblical law that a person could serve for up to 6 years, and then the 7th year was the year of release. It goes back to the common law period, based upon this idea, if you didn't pay back your loan, you could declare bankruptcy, but for 7 years, you weren't supposed to be borrowing anything because you had failed to pay back. That's based upon this principle. But yeah, there could be consequences. And if it was if the person had been deceitful and it was actually theft, so if something had been entrusted into your hands and you conveniently lost it and it was a thing of value, you could be forced to make restitution, even double. So there were consequences to not paying back to not paying back a loan, and they would hurt. But there are also rights that the lender has. All right, let's look at verse 12, unless anybody else has any more comments on that. Verse 12, and if he is a poor man, you shall not sleep in his pledge. You shall restore to him the pledge as the sun sets, that he may sleep in his cloak and bless you, and it shall be righteousness for you before the Lord your God. So now, why, I wonder if anybody, if I hadn't learned this, I'd probably be slow to get this. Maybe somebody would know it. I have talked about it before, I suppose. Why would you even want the pledge of a garment if you just have to give it back at the end of the night? Anybody got any thoughts on that? Keep in mind, a garment was a thing of value. So, like when Jesus talks about laying out up treasures on earth where rust and moth doth corrupt, where thieves break in and steal, moth destroys garments. And garments used to represent an enormous amount of labor and harvesting flax or wool and putting it on a loom and making it into cloth. I mean, today clothing is so cheap. We wear new clothing every day. Many people had maybe one garment, and only a wealthy person had a closet full. And poor people, a garment is a thing of, it may take a lot of time and effort to make and therefore buy a garment. It was a thing of value. May represent weeks of work. So a garment was worth something. You got a thought?
If somebody was going to a wedding and they didn't have anything, I could see them saying, hey, it's like nowadays we'd say, hey, can I borrow a suit because I have this special event going to?
That's true. They may borrow it, yeah. Well, in this case, though, it's talking about the security for a loan. So let's look at it. And if he is a poor man, you shall not sleep in his pledge. Pledge being his collateral. This is word for collateral. So a person would come to you and say, I tell you what, I got this garment. It's worth, 2 weeks' wages, whatever that is. It's worth 2 weeks' wages. I would like to use it as a pledge for a loan. But you have to give it back to me every night to sleep in because otherwise I'll be cold. Now we look at that and we're like, that doesn't make sense. But here's the purpose of it. He couldn't go to Cano over here and say, hey man, will you loan me 2 weeks' wages on this garment? Yeah, sure, I'll loan it to you. Okay, good. Hey, Adrian, can you loan me 2 weeks' wages on this garment? And you go to 7 different people and say, well, I'm sorry, I can't pay you all back. Here's my garment. You all fight over it. It's collateral for all of my loans. You could only use this collateral once. But God said at night, the poor man has to be able to sleep in it or he'll be cold. The idea is you couldn't take one thing could not be a pledge for many loans. Now, this has an application to our modern banking system. Anybody heard of fractional reserve banking? You go to the bank and you put $100 in the bank. How many times will that bank loan out your money? I've heard 10 times. It's probably worse. Who knows what it really is? So you go and you put $100 in the bank. I was like, great. Yeah, sure, I'll pay you 0.2% interest on that. That sounds great. I'll keep it safe for you. Meanwhile, because we loan out bank notes, which, by the way, is a debt. A note is a promise to pay. And I used to, just for the fun of it, I would ask people, cashiers, I'd say, do you accept Federal Reserve bank notes? I was like, no, sir, we don't accept those. And I'd pull out a dollar bill. I'd say, read the top of that. It says Federal Reserve bank note, It's not federal, there is no reserve, and it's not a note, because traditionally, a note, like I think before Nixon, you could take, maybe it was earlier than that, I think Nixon was the one that got us off the gold standard, so maybe I'm a little bit wrong, but you could actually take your dollar bill, right, and exchange it for a Spanish milled dollar and get a dollar coin back. And then, they started playing with all kinds of money with the games, but now you can't exchange a banknote for... It's a promise to pay, but there's what's backing it? The full faith and credit of the United States government, right? A whole lot of missiles, I guess. But fractional reserve banking is another crazy atrocity where they can take your money, and because nobody can actually go and get the money all out of the bank, and they say, oh, we guarantee it up to so much. But they can loan out your $100 to like 10 people all at once. Because the assumption is not everybody's going to take their money out of the bank at the same time, which would lead to a crash, right? A bank crash, bank run, a bank crash, which happened in what, 1929, whatever, 1929, stock market crash and all. They had a bank run. But that violates this principle. That, here it's speaking of, hey, Sam, can you come up here and help me? I can't read this right now. I got off maybe it's here. I can't. I got off this thing somehow. Here it's talking about a garment, but if it applies to a garment, see, what we're supposed to do with biblical case laws is take the principle, extract the principle from it, and apply it in other areas. And this forbids loaning out the same thing over and over again. Thank you so much. Sounds like Joel has chosen our Bible study to do the weed eating, I think. I'm blaming him because I saw his truck, but it couldn't be someone else. Anyway, but the person, here's the other principle I think here, is that did I skip here? Yes. There's another principle here that this is not an antagonistic lending system. The banking wasn't supposed to be. God didn't want his people thinking, oh, I know I'm going to get rich by oppressing people, by getting people between a rock and a hard place, and saying, if you don't pay me, you're going to be cold at night because I'm taking away your stuff. In fact, banking was, for the most part, supposed to be interest-free loans. Now today, because of the time value of money, interest-free loans actually end up costing the lender, because by the time he gets the money back, the money's worth less than the day he lended it, because we have a fractional reserve banking system, an inflationary currency that violates, there's nothing backing it, unjust weights and measures all day long. But it was, a loan is something that two people who trust one another could shake hands. Maybe they write it out so that they know specifically what they're agreeing to do, which is always a good idea, right? But it wasn't a hostile, oppressive tool. It wasn't meant to be an oppressive tool. It was meant to be, hey, you need help. You need help to get through some hard times, or you've got a great business idea. I'll invest in your business and share a little bit in the profit. But it wasn't meant to be a tool of oppression. We have nowadays payday loans with like 18, 19%. And people, why would anybody do that? Because they're very poor and they don't want to get evicted. Or they're very sick and they need some medicine and they're between a rock and a hard place. And that is oppression. And that is what God doesn't want them doing. So the borrower, in this case a poor man, needs something to sleep in. And the assumption is he has one garment. But I think this would extend to many things. The idea of you're to consider the poor man. Do not use the poor man's status to manipulate him. You're to help him out. The poor man's supposed to be an interest-free loan. It's to be a hand up, not a hand out, a hand up. And the poor man is on his honor, is supposed to pay it back. The wicked borrower don't pay back. But the idea was you help people out, and you give and it shall be given unto you. And we've talked about that in past weeks, how Jesus says, lend and don't expect to receive again. Talking about lending to a poor brother. And we talked some weeks ago about lending for a business venture is different than lending to a poor person, because a poor person is desperate, and you're not to take advantage of a person's desperate condition to make money off them. That's the biblical principle here. You're to consider the fact that he needs something to sleep in. You're to consider that he needs something to grind his bread with, and you're not to oppress him. So this idea of taking advantage of people who are between a rock and a hard place, God says, no, you look to him to bless you, and he will. You don't need oppression to become a very wealthy people. Thoughts on this? Visitors, you're welcome to speak up. Feel free if you got a thought. Otherwise, we'll move on. Sam's got one. Okay.
I was just thinking about the higher interest that's charged to somebody with bad credit with that idea of, well, since you're less trustworthy, we're going to charge you a much higher rate of interest, when in reality this is not found here. It's like, it's the same rate for everybody, but if you're not a trustworthy person, then maybe that person won't lend to you at all. Or if you're a poor person, then and he didn't know it or whatever, then he has to do this and actually let it go. So I don't know if that is accurate representation of what we're seeing here, but that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, it's an interesting observation, and it may be correct. I know the pushback that would come on it. If you have somebody who consistently pays back, or even a group of people, let's say people with a higher credit score consistently pay back, if you lend to those people, you get your money returned more often, plus it's profitable. But if you have a group of people who consistently don't pay back, it's higher risk and you're going to lose more money. So I think what you're dealing with here is that, again, it's the idea here most of the time is we're talking about families lending, families and friends lending to each other rather than a large banking system. In Israel, they had a gold-based currency. Every family had an inheritance, an allotment of land. And there was lots of poor tithes and charitable institutions to help people get on their feet. So we just have a totally different economic system than what you have here. And a lot of I think some of the best application is even when you're considering making a loan to a friend or whatever, consider what kind of loan it is. Is it a person between a rock and a hard place? Then just, and also if you're a borrower, then remember the wicked borrower don't pay back. But like one thing I've heard about the Jewish community in the early, even the early 1900s, the 1800s, when lots of poor Jews were coming over from Europe, the Jewish community would raise money for charitable loans, interest-free, to help fellow Jews. And if someone didn't pay back, the disgrace was very severe. People, most of the time, the loan got paid back. And there was no interest. Because the Bible says that a Jew can loan to a non-Jew at interest, but a brother is a different thing. And Jews look out for Jews. And a lot of people get angry about that, but it's like, well, do you look out for your family? Do you look out for your friends and loved ones? Instead of getting envious and mad about it, why not go and do likewise? Help people out. I've had people that help me out at different times in life, and I've helped people out at different times in life. And I've been a recipient and a beneficiary, and I've been a benefactor at different times. And I just think it's, especially as you get older, when you're young, you need a hand up, and then you get up in life and you can give other people a hand up. I think it's part of the pattern what we should expect in life as we help young people get careers and jobs and get a start in life. So many, I say this oftentimes, I would rather give my children their start than my finish. Meaning, I would rather help them get started in life, and when the day comes and I die, it's like, well, yeah, Dad's got a little bit, got some money, Dad's got some money saved, because good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, but, we don't need it. We're doing fine. That's what I like. We don't need it. I hope that my grandchildren aren't going, man, when's that old man going to kick the bucket so we can get, you know what I mean? I don't want that. I would rather give them their start, and part of that for us was making the choice in our family to homeschool instead of having two incomes and maybe having more at the day of my death to give away because we worked, both of us. We chose, well, we're going to sacrifice at the beginning of their life to give them their start in life, and that's the choice we decided to make. But when you're young, get a hand up, and when you get old, be ready to give a hand up. Don't, when I was young, I used to like to get something free. And now I'm like, nah, I'm a little ashamed. Something free doesn't really, I'm not saying I'm always opposed to something free, but I don't like to just go get something, seeing free on a sign doesn't entice me like when I was pretty poor, It's like, I don't want to be just on the receiving end all the time. I want to be able to give. And I think Jesus said it's better to give than to receive. It's a mentality that we should have, I think, as God's people is, you transition from, I need a hand up, please help me, having the humility to receive a hand up. And then as you get older, it's like, okay, now it's time to transition from being on the take to more and more being a giver. And I'm really grateful. You can also give when you're young in different ways. Like I love it when there's a moving day or a work day and the young people get together and paint each other's houses and help them move and getting together, not just for the young people. But a community that helps each other out is a beautiful thing, is what I'm trying to say. And if we get to the last verse in this chapter, it swings around to generosity. So let's move forward. Let's go to the next one here. I'm talking a lot, and I was worried I wouldn't have enough to talk about, and here I am going on and on. Deuteronomy 24:14, you shall not oppress a hired worker who is poor and needy, whether he is one of your brothers or one of the sojourners who are in your land within your towns. You shall give him his wages on the same day before the sun sets, for he is poor and counts on it, lest he cry against you to the Lord and you be guilty of sin. All right, now this is interesting. Why do you think he says, keep in mind they didn't have payroll with computers and everything. What do you think's the spirit of the law here? What is it that it's saying? You don't oppress the hired worker, the poor, the needy, by holding back their money beyond sunset. Why do you think that is?
Because it might be easy to, if somebody was desperate for money and looking for work, you could say, okay, well, I'll pay you next week if you work for me, because they're desperate. They'll take it. Unlike everybody else that you have working for you, you pay them like, every day or something like that.
Yeah.
So you're taking what do you call it? You're taking advantage of it.
Victoria, you're not on the job, sweet. You hear them talking, you got to come so they can, nobody heard that online. Yeah, so you're saying someone's in a desperate situation and you think, well, I'll pay you next week, and they'll take it because they're desperate. And meanwhile, you get to enjoy the money, the time value of the money. The money's still in your possession. You get the money and you get the work. So money has time value. What would you rather have, $100 today or $1,000 15 years from now? Well, maybe it depends who you are. Some people will be like, I don't know if I'm going to be alive in 15 years from now. I think I'd like the $100. Or I'm hungry today. I need that $100. By 15 years from now, I might not need it. Another person might say, oh well, I'd rather have $1,000 15 years from now. That's a really good return on my money. But the point is money has time value. Money is worth more today than it is a week from now. And it's a form of oppression, theft even, to say, I will pay you. I'm going to, I'll tell you a common application today. I think it's understood when you go apply for a job, it takes some time to get you in the payroll, and because of taxes and everything, it takes time to pay people. Although if I hire a day laborer, like if I just needed somebody for the day, I will try to pay them soon, whether it's today or an agreed on time pretty soon. It may not be convenient to go to the bank today, but I'll try to, if they need the money now because they're hungry, like say there's a guy that says, man, I need a hotel for the night, and say, well, I'll hire you to come clean my backyard. Well, then give him his money at the end of the day. That's why he's working. And that's the idea here. He's a hired worker. He's a poor man. But where a lot of people do it is supply chain. A business will say, well, I'll keep the money, which may be even earning me interest, and the people that supply the materials, I'll wait to pay them. I can defer it for months at a time, and I think that's a violation of the principle. You're enjoying the money, the time value of the money, and you're defrauding your supplier. That's a form of oppression. You want to say something?
Yeah, I think all of it comes down to verse 17. It's that we're going to get to, is he kind of highlights everything on there. He says, you shall not pervert justice due to the sojourner or the fatherless, or take the widow's garment in pledge. So he kind of goes back to everything that we were just talking about, and the whole point is you shall not pervert justice.
Yeah, you shall not pervert the justice due to the sojourner or the fatherless, or take a widow's garment in pledge. But you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore, I command you to do this.
So I think that ties in even with this. It's saying, hey, you're not going to do this for one person and then do the opposite another, because you wouldn't like that if the government was doing that over trials or everything. So in all of our life is, we're not to pervert justice or do falsely on that.
Yeah, and what you notice here, since we're skipping ahead, we did skip a very crucial verse. Maybe we'll get to that verse next week, because it's really, this verse is really on topic. It kind of goes off a little bit, talking about not punishing the father for the sins of the son, etc. But the sojourner, well, he's not from around here. Doesn't even speak English. I can easily pay him less money. That's oppression. The fatherless, he doesn't have a dad to speak up for him. I can take advantage of him, the fatherless. The widow, she doesn't have a husband. She's a little woman. I can bully her. It's easy to bully, oppress sojourners, the fatherless, and the widows. He says, but you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore, I command you to do this. In other words, it's kind of an application of love your neighbors yourself. Remember, you were a slave once, and I called you out to be a free people, and therefore, I don't want you to be like the Egyptian taskmaster, who was an oppressor. They were referred to as oppressors over and over again. And a lot of these tactics are Egypt's tactics of oppression. God wants his people to be a generous and free people. And part of that is not oppressing. See, I think Democrats, for a long time, Democrats and Republicans have liked illegal immigration. A lot of very, on one side, people were like, wow, cheap labor. And I think that goes for both Democrats and Republicans, but let's say that that's more a Republican side. Cheap labor. There's a lot of big businesses that get cheap labor from illegal immigrants, right? It could be just as easy the other way. It all depends on who's what. Big corporations are willing to grease anybody's palm, whether Democrat or Republican. That's the truth about it. And the other side might be like, well, we can really appeal to them and get votes. But really, God says you're not to pervert justice. You're not to treat the sojourner, the fatherless, or the widow. You're to have one standard for everybody. You're to love your neighbor as yourself. You're not to oppress anyone. And so that's why neither party for decades is like, oh, they'll complain about it. They'll talk about it. I mean, both parties used to talk about building the wall a long time ago. I've heard quotes of, I think even Biden talking about we ought to build a wall from way back, I believe. But God, either way, God doesn't want us to oppress the stranger. Doesn't say give them citizenship, by the way. In fact, earlier in the last chapter, it warned against giving foreigners citizenship, because if they are not assimilated and they don't have the Hebrew, this is my words, if they don't have the Hebrew God and the Hebrew ethics, then you could very quickly, by immigration, have, it's like all the Midianites show up and said, oh, we'll take this land, right? And then you're not an Israelite people anymore. And that's a danger, is that you get overwhelmed by a different worldview. I think a lot of Europe is experiencing that with Islam. You have a huge amount of immigrants from Islamic countries, and now they've got the minarets all over the place, and they've got, Muslim rape gangs, and they've got areas wanting to go under Sharia law, and you're going to have the problems that come from being greatly outnumbered by people who openly tell you they want to put you under their God and their law system, because Islam is a political system as well as a religious system. So God doesn't say make all of the strangers, the sojourners, make them citizens and give them power over you. But he does say don't oppress them. Don't take advantage of them. Love them. Love your neighbor as yourself, whether a sojourner or a widow or the fatherless. Brian, you got something?
No, I was going to say something, but I changed my mind.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, I do, because I thought of that one. Right. Go ahead. No, bring Kanoa the thing. This is a good point. Yeah, just like Kanoa have a
the other thing with that, of like you're saying, it doesn't matter if they're a foreigner or not. That even applies with, this is something that I use when dealing with the case on abortion, with dealing with certain groups that try to say, well, we should just do heartbeat bills. And I say, well, hey, that's perverting justice, because it's saying the children before that who are human made in the image of God just like us. It's saying, well, it's saying, okay, all the humans before that heartbeat bill can be murdered, but everybody out here is fine. And I say that's perverting justice. Because what we're saying is who then can be murdered. We're saying this group of class, because they don't look like us, can be murdered, but not this group now, because they have something that we consider to be more like us, like a heart. And so that's, another verse that I bring up all the time is, hey, you shall not pervert justice. That's why we can't do this, and we need to have equal rights and protection for all human beings at the moment of conception, because we're all made in the image of God.
And also, I was thinking about abortion too, because the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widows do not have the means, do not have as much means to organize and fight for their rights. That's why even in the parable of the widow before the unjust judge, she feared neither God nor man, but because she kept wearying him with her continual coming, she finally answered her request. The idea being that widows are often taken advantage of because they have no one to speak up for them. They're alone. They're so alone. There's no one more alone than preborn children.
I was going to say that's another way to get votes, is if this is still going, then, hey, keep voting us in. We'll end it someday.
Yeah.
So that's, taking advantage of a small group, or taking advantage of a small group and allowing them to be brutally murdered so that you can use it as a rise in your political campaign by saying, hey, we'll end it. Just keep voting me in. Keep voting me in.
If only we could hear all of their cries. If only all of their cries could be blasted over speakers, but no one hears them. And so out of sight, out of mind. And it is definitely oppression. And it's just the height of hypocrisy to speak of the woman's rights when the ultimate form of oppression is to torture and dismember the child. It is the most heinous oppression I can really think of. It is oppressing the fatherless. Here's the word oppress used in the verse earlier in verse 14. A primitive root, to press upon, oppress, defraud, violate, overthrow, get deceitfully, deceive, defraud, drink up, oppression, do violence. And again, Hamas was another word. Hamas is another word for oppress. It means violence. And abortion is violence. It is not the big issue. Well, I shouldn't say it's not the big issue on the ticket right now. It may be the biggest issue. And if it is, we're going to know shortly. But yeah, somebody needs to speak up for the fatherless, because we're to love our neighbor as ourselves. Boy, I had a passage that summed it all up, but it also went into the one about, I think I'll maybe save that other one for next week, though. Let me go to 19. We'll come back to one of them. I skipped one verse tonight, but this is still on the oppressor, I think. When you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat your olive trees, you shall not go over them again. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, you shall not strip it afterward. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, therefore I command you to do this. Fascinating scripture, I think. So when you're harvesting some of the, sometimes you're cutting the wheat or whatever, and some of the wheat falls on the ground. He says, don't get the stuff you just dropped, leave it there. Same thing when you shake the olive trees. Some of them fall off real easy onto the ground, onto the canvas or whatever they're catching it with. He says, but don't go over it a second time. Don't go over it again. Go over your grapes once. When you think it's the ripest, go get as many grapes as you can. If there's green ones, leave it. And then what this meant was it was a real loss. If you're trying to suck every bit of profit out of your farm, it's a genuine loss to the landholder, right? He's really losing. But to the fatherless, the widow, like Ruth in the book of Ruth, it is a means of providing for themselves, but it's not just a handout. It requires them to do what? To work. And I think that a lot of the modern welfare system, by not requiring people to work, it makes people get very comfortable with the idea of like, oh, this is very comfortable. It's not, there's no human. And also think about this. If in order to feed yourself, you're like, well, you know what, I'm out of work right now. Maybe I'm out of work because of my own fault. Maybe it's not my own fault. Maybe my land burned down. But at least we can go over to Farmer Joe's over there and we can get his, Jebediah over there, and we can get his grapes and his olives that are left because he left it. People might see the worker out there and say, wow, look, I know that guy's in need because he's out there gleaning. He wouldn't be gleaning if he didn't need it. I know what I'll do. I'll give him a job. Right? I like the way he hustles. I'll give him a job. I think even with slavery, there's this advantage of a person, for a period of time, they go to work, they get a skill. If they worked hard, they got a reputation of working hard. Guess what they got waiting for them when they're done with their 6 years? Probably 10 people saying, hey, you done with him? I want him to work on my farm, and I will pay him well. So it doesn't dehumanize, like just writing a check. When the government writes a check, it's not their money. It's money they collected at the barrel of a gun. It's easy to write a check that you didn't earn. The farmer, it was a genuine act of generosity for the farmer. In the case of Boaz, Boaz saw Ruth out there and he said, hey guys, intentionally drop some. We don't need all of that. She's out there, leave some clumps, makes it easy for her to pick up. But he didn't say, hey, Ruth, tell you what, just show up and I'll just give you already harvested. He didn't. He let her get out there and work. He saw how she worked, and then he ended up marrying her after she worked. He saw what kind of woman she was. And he didn't hire her, he married her. And she became the mother of Obed, the father of Jesse, the father of David. So she's, whatever that is, great-grandmother of David, a Moabitess who had a good work ethic. So I think there's a lesson to learn here about charity. Handouts can destroy people. And that's why, like in 1 Timothy 3:10, it says, if a man doesn't work, neither should he eat. Like just giving money to a person, like why? If 10 cars in an hour give a guy $2 to $5, let's say $2. He's making $20 an hour, and he makes more if he looks pitiful and dirty than if he looks well put together. What are you incentivizing? You're incentivizing like, well, I got to figure out a way to look more pitiful. I won't shave, and I'll look as ragged as I can, and I'll get out there and maybe make $25, $30 an hour. And it incentivizes, and it's like, now I don't have to be accountable to anybody. If I go work for a job, they tell me to do things I don't like to. I don't want to clean toilets. I don't want to work over a deep fryer. I don't want to pick up mess. I don't want to have to bend over and pick something up. It's much easier to beg. There was a time like there were beggars that in the Bible that didn't have legs. I mean, that's a situation. But you know what? In Romania, the gypsies are well known for, at times, like children. It's been known. I've heard the same thing in India. Children being beaten when they're young, like given made blind, or breaking their legs, crippling them, so that they could make a lot of money as a beggar. This happens. I heard about this before the movie Slumdog Millionaire came out, which that's part of the theme of that movie if you've ever seen it. One of the kids sings and he's blind, and they blinded him on purpose so that because a blind kid that can sing makes more money than a kid with eyes that can sing. So you blind him in order to make more money. It's a racket, and it happens. But biblical charity, it was the bottom line, it was a real act of generosity on the part of the farmer, but it enabled people to identify that person has a good work ethic, and it notified the people that person's in need. So if there's a widow out there, the fatherless out there, the sojourners out there, you might say, hey, I noticed you out in the field picking up sheaves and olives and grapes, and if you'd like some work, I've got some work that needs to be done. And if they prove themselves in that, you may say, man, I want to keep you around. You're a moneymaker, right? So I think there's lessons here. Charity can be very destructive. It can break down the family. It can lead to father. You know, if you've got a government that's willing to write a check as long as there's not a man in the home, what are you going to get? A lot of single mother homes. A lot of fatherless children looking for a father, joining a street gang, even finding fatherhood in the local prison and liking it because they're so desperate for male attention. That's what you get. So a lot of the wisdom of God's word isn't readily apparent, all the effects. You read this and you're like, oh, this is kind of an interesting law. But when we violate these principles, we don't understand all of the consequences that follow. There's a lot more, and that's why it's important for people, God's people, to understand these things, because they can be applied to our life. It makes sense also to apply it here for your children. What kind of children are you raising? Now, that's where the rubber meets the road for us, right? If you do everything for your children, dads, if you do everything for your children and you don't have them do anything, or you just, every time, it's like, oh, you made a mess, I'll clean it up for you. As soon as you can have your children work and contribute and learn skills, pick up their own mess, contribute to the house, the better. Because if you don't, you'll raise an entitled child that feels like they won't be happy. Because guess what? Entitled people aren't happy people. If you have a child that you spoil a child, you do everything for them, you give them everything they want, you never tell them no. What do you have? An unhappy, entitled brat that can't get along with anybody because they feel entitled. It is unkind to do everything for your children. It is unkind to never spank your children, I would contend. It's an unkindness. That's why Proverbs says, he that spares the rod hates his child. If you want your children to be divorced, not hold down a job, be a drug addict, and be unhappy, I mean, you can go the other way too. You can be abusive. But spoil them and you can ruin their life. I mean, I'm not saying be abusive, but I'm saying spoil them. And that's what you see here is it was and you know what? It takes sacrifice as a parent too, because so often as a parent, you're like, man, it's easier to do it myself rather than teach my kid to do it. I'll just do it. If you delegate it, they might do it wrong and cost you, and then you got to go fix what they did. They'll burn something, cut something wrong, do something wrong, break something. Leave grass in the lawn that didn't get mowed and doesn't look as good as if you did it yourself. Yeah, but what are you raising, a lawn or a child? So it gets practical. We can talk to the family. I think we can talk church. If you've been coming here for a while and still don't bring anything and you don't help clean up, you're not ever here to volunteer or do anything, think about that. Maybe you're the spoiled child. We ought to all serve. Serving is a privilege. So when I say that because I read a scripture like this and say, okay, how do we apply this civilly? How do we apply this to the family? How do we apply this to the church? How do we apply it to ourselves as individuals? That's the grid I think through things. I'm not saying that because I'm wanting to pick on anybody. When I read a scripture and I identify a principle, this is my hermeneutic. I say, okay, how might that apply to a family? How might that apply to the church? How might that apply to the civil government? That's the way we should read these laws. Find the principle. Paul finds laws that deal with the civil government, like executing people, and he applies it to church discipline, which means the principle can be applied in many areas, including the family, the individual, the church, and the state. And that's the way we should apply it. Okay, I've talked long enough now. Any final thoughts? Canoa still got the microphone? Brian? Brian's going. Here it is, Brian.
I just think that the challenge for us would be how to find out how to apply this if you're an investment banker. How do you leave your fields gleanable for others, or what can you provide essentially for the poor or for the needy so that we don't have to have a welfare state, because for us, Christians, we would like to see the love of God worked out in our lives so that we don't need the government taking care of people, because I think it is the responsibility of the church to do that. And the problem is that people would have to humble themselves in a fashion because people are proud, but to come and to glean a field, you might get seen. Somebody might see you. But still, you come and you do that when you have need. Okay, now people can hide in their homes and they receive a check And they don't have to do anything. They don't have to go to church. They don't have to listen to the gospel. They don't have to do anything on their part. And I think it's criminal, because you have institutionalized welfare. Now, unfortunately, I have had to take advantage of, food stamps a time or two. I was in a situation where I had to go out and do day jobs. And I'll tell you what, I counted on that money at the end of the day. And if they didn't pay me, it made me very angry. Because I'm like, hey, I came here and I worked for $10 an hour and I really busted my hump. And I did more. I did twice as much as you asked me to do, and I did it well. And it was worth double what you're paying me. So I want that money, And so
Did they give it to you?
Oh, they did. Yeah, I didn't have to threaten them at all.
Yeah.
But
it's good to understand principle, though.
These old principles apply today in our lives everywhere. I mean, you just got to see how it works out. So I would just encourage everybody, no matter what it is you do, find a way to leave the corners of your field, ungleaned.
And you notice, I pointed this out before, but when it talks about not harvesting the corners of your field, it doesn't tell you how big a corner is. Yeah. And I think that could vary in a variety of ways. There might be years where it's so prosperous and everybody has so much money, it's just going to sit out there and rot, and you might just give a little token sheaf. It's like, nobody around me is poor, right? And there might be years where it's like, man, I really don't need much, and you have a huge corner of your field for the people that need it, But it was left up to the discretion of the farmer, and the generosity, and how much he depended upon the Lord. I think we can think about these gleaning laws even in terms of businesses. Like I've heard of businesses that hire mentally challenged people, or to do a job that maybe maybe they don't actually bring, maybe the amount of labor they do isn't actually profitable, but it's a way of saying, hey, God's blessed us with an abundance. We're going to give them a job. They have a dignified job to do. And if people also believe in that, they can contribute to it by doing business here. So it's like, I want to do business there because I know when I go do business there, this business, I'm also partaking in the causes that they're behind. You hear about businesses, like I ran into a guy recently. We sold something on Facebook to a guy who has a coffee shop, and he grinds his own coffee, roasts and grinds it, and he's doing some kind of mission project with it. I got to talking to him. At the moment, I can't think of what it is. But he has multiple businesses, and he actually developed the coffee business for a charitable purpose. So I love it when Christians think that way. A man whose story, just a fantastic story, R.G. Letourneau, there's a book called Mover of Men and Mountains, and this guy invented machines that in the early 1900s that were able to carve through our rock. Like many of our highways were built by his machines. The oil rigs that are out there that are on a tripod, he invented that. Adam Payne, who works at a machine shop here in St. Louis, he's like, I'd never heard of this guy before, and he invented all kinds of machines that are around me every day, But he lived on like 2% of what he brought in or less, and he gave the rest away. And he was into helping other nations develop businesses and trades. Again, a lot of our charity, even our charity to Africa and different places, sometimes is meant well, but it's destructive to people. And we need to think about it. But Letourneau really tried to give people a hand up and not just a hand out in order to bring industry to places that didn't have it so they could provide for themselves. I was part of a ministry that would buy, in Romania, that would buy like tractors for villages, dig wells, but it was always, we want something in exchange, namely coming to church, and doing other things. But they always tried to give a hand up, not just a hand out, that would elevate the whole village and give them the equipment necessary to feed themselves. And I thought that was a beautiful model. Mark, would you close us in prayer tonight?